Hello, young soul. What I'm about to tell you happened a few years ago, but to this day, every night, I see the scene as if it were yesterday. I was at my grandmother's house, in the countryside. An isolated place where everything seemed slower, denser, as if time didn't hold the same value. My father never spoke much about it. Whenever we touched on the subject, he would change the topic. So I never asked too much. But that afternoon, while sorting through some things in the old house, I found something I never imagined I would, a letter, crumpled and torn at the edges, hidden inside a thick book that I had never seen anyone read. It was a farewell letter. From my father. He had written words that, honestly, I never thought he would be capable of writing. He had always been reserved, distant, but that was different. He was asking for forgiveness. Forgive me for leaving without an explanation, son. I know you don't understand, but I did what I couldn't avoid. The words were written with a desperate urgency, as if he regretted something he could never fix. The letter spoke of a secret. Something he did, something that, according to him, would condemn him forever. But the most disturbing part was the ending. The last sentence, stained with what seemed to be a drop of ink or something else, read, "If you want to know what happened, if you want to talk to me again, the price will be high. Do not dare to call me unless you are ready to pay the consequences." I didn't understand, of course. At that time, I was still just a boy seeking answers. And that letter was undoubtedly the answer to a void I had carried since the day my father left without warning. My father never came back, and my mother never spoke about him. But that letter, it called to me. It made me want to understand what really happened. I wasn't quite sure what he meant by that. But that night, after days of wrestling with doubt, I decided to try. I wanted answers. I needed them, even if the price was high. So I took the letter, grabbed an old candle, and went down to the basement. The place was moldy and cold, the smell of old wood and dust enveloping me as I prepared myself. I had never been superstitious, but the stories my mother told about the basement came back to my mind. The place where things were stored, the things no one wanted to remember. With the candle lit, I looked at the letter and began to read the words. There was no turning back. The air felt heavier with each syllable I spoke, and deep down in my soul, I sensed that something was wrong. But I had already started. If you can hear me, Dad, I'm ready. I'm ready to understand. The candle began to flicker, shadows stretched along the walls in a strange manner, as if they had a life of their own. The silence grew thick, almost unbearable. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, and at that moment, everything seemed to heat up and cool down at the same time. Then the lights flickered and, with a crack, went completely out. In the dark, I heard something. Something that shouldn't be there. Something that shouldn't be possible. The candle went out, but a presence, an indescribable feeling of being watched, froze me in place. I knew I was not alone. And that's when a voice, weak and trembling, whispered behind me, "You called me." That voice. It was not just a sound. It was a presence, a horrible sensation that spread throughout my entire body. It was not human. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't my father. The air in the basement felt denser, heavier, and the smell of mold, of something rotting, was unbearable. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. I couldn't take my eyes off the darkness where the voice had emerged. Then it came again, this time closer, almost as if it were whispering directly in my ear. "You called me. You don't know what you've done." Those words wrapped around my mind, as if they were not words, but chains binding my soul. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and something inside me knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I had made a terrible mistake. I didn't know what else to do. My mouth was dry, fear consumed me, and my body seemed unresponsive. But something compelled me to look down at the floor. That's when I saw it. I don't know how I hadn't noticed before, but now it seemed impossible to ignore. On the wooden floor, where dust and debris had accumulated, there was something. Something damp and dark, a stain that sped. Slowly, as if it were crawling, almost alive. I tried to scream, but my throat was tight, soundless. Then the smell worsened. It was foul, unbearable. As if something were rotting right there in the depths of the basement. But the strangest part was that the stain was not just dirt or some liquid. It was more, It was shaping, taking forms that looked human. Through the flickers of the candlelight, I could see more clearly. It was a human shape, but with torn, distorted skin. Something that no longer resembled a living body, but a twisted copy of what a human being should be. I didn't know what I was seeing, but I knew I shouldn't be seeing it. The thing seemed to be moving slowly, as if it were watching me too. "You called me. Now you will pay the price," the voice said, this time coming from a point so close that I felt a cold breath on my neck. I tried to scream, but the voice was muffled, as if the words were trapped inside me. It was as if the air around me was compressing, becoming denser and more unbearable with each passing second. I turned to flee, but the path was blocked. The basement was no longer the same. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the floor felt like it was crumbling. I couldn't breathe, and the sensation of being watched, that something was lurking, left me out of control. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, a low, almost imperceptible laugh began to echo through the basement. A laugh that didn't belong to any human being. "There's no turning back. It's already done," the voice said, now louder, clearer. My body trembled, and with my heart racing, I looked at the candle that, despite being about to go out, still flickered. It was enough for me to see, once again, the distorted shape crawling toward me. It drew closer, and now, by the candlelight, I saw clearly. It was the image of my father, or what was left of him. The skin dried like a mass of round flesh, the bones broken and twisted, and his eyes. The eyes were empty, yet still fixed on me. "You called for me. Now you will be like me. There will be no peace." The thing reached out, and I realized, with absolute horror, that it was not alone. There were more. Many more. In every corner of the basement, shapes emerged, twisted, deformed, with empty eyes watching me. They were the others my father had lost. Those he had caused. I screamed, finally, but the only response I received was the laughter intensifying, echoing in my mind, tearing at my soul. The ground beneath me cracked, and I fell. I don't know where, I don't know how, but everything around me was shattering. The deformed figures, the laughter, and the unbearable stench surrounded me, and I knew that, at that moment, everything I had done had been an irreparable mistake. And the worst was that I felt there was no escape anymore. I was lost in the deepest, darkest place, and the one I had called my father was no longer him. It was something older, darker. I tried to go home, but when I looked into the entrance mirror, it was no longer my reflection that was there. I saw the same empty gaze, the same dilated, lifeless eyes. And I knew. I was already one of them. I no longer knew where the nightmare ended and where my reality began. When I looked into the mirror and saw that thing in place of my reflection, something inside me shattered once and for all. I felt that, somehow, I was no longer me. The mirror reflected the empty eyes, like those of a corpse, and the sensation that my body no longer belonged to me spread, like a poison slowly taking over every cell. I stepped back, staggering, and took a step away. The house seemed to be disintegrating around me. The sound of the floorboards creaking beneath my feet echoed, amplified, disconcertingly, and a wave of vertigo hit me hard. As if the place was about to swallow me whole, as if the walls were closing in around me. At that moment, the silence was interrupted again, but not by a voice. It was a low, hissing sound coming from the direction of the basement. It was a dragging sound, as if something was moving through the house, but in a completely wrong way. Something heavy, something that shouldn't be moving, dragging itself in such a slow and repulsive manner that I could almost feel each movement in my guts. That house. I now felt it was alive, that it was watching me. I was no longer alone there. Something was watching me. Something that had taken the place of my father and the others I had summoned. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself that it was all just an illusion. But the smell, the foul stench of decomposing flesh, of something that had been buried for a long time, filled the air. It was unbearable, as if death was about to materialize before me. When I finally managed to open my eyes, I realized the hallway in front of me seemed darker, denser. The air was heavy, almost impossible to breathe. Something, or someone, was there with me. I looked down the hallway. In the dim light, I saw a silhouette. But not an ordinary silhouette, like that of a person. It was a distorted shape, moving with a fluidity that made no sense. The extremities of the body seemed to stretch and shrink, as if the human structure could no longer support them. The thing had no face. Or at least, it didn't have a human face. The smell of rotting flesh grew stronger, and I felt my throat tighten. I knew I was about to vomit, but I couldn't move. My legs were paralyzed. The creature was approaching, each of its steps echoing down the hallway, and I knew that somehow, it knew exactly where I was. When it was just a few meters away from me, I felt an unbearable pressure on my chest, as if the weight of the entire world had fallen onto me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't move. I was at its mercy. And then, the creature whispered. The voice was a dragging sound, as if thousands of voices in pain and suffering were trapped within a torn throat, trying to speak at once. The voice said, "You summoned what you shouldn't have. Now, I am the only answer you will find." The eyes, or what was left of them, turned to me, empty and unbearable, as if they knew every sin and every regret I held. Each of my fears was reflected there, and the thing drew even closer. I desperately tried to move, but my body seemed to be trapped, held by something that was no longer physical. It was a presence, something I had unleashed that now would not leave me in peace. When the creature touched my shoulder, the sensation was like a hot iron being driven into my flesh. I screamed, but no sound came from my mouth. It was as if my body was being emptied, as if something was draining my soul, leaving me hollow. And then, without my noticing, time stopped. The sound, the pressure, the smell, everything fell into absolute silence. I was suspended between the world of the living and the dead, lost in a spiral of terror that seemed endless. That's when I heard, once again, my father's voice. Not the voice of the creature, but his voice, as if it were coming from within me. "You shouldn't have called me. Now it's too late." I was on the brink of losing my sanity, on the verge of completely surrendering to terror, when an invisible force pulled me back, and everything around me shattered. The hallway, the house, the presence, everything vanished. I woke up in bed, sweating, with my heart racing uncontrollably. I was in my room, in the house, but something was different. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't the same silence. It was a strange, tense silence, as if something was lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And that's when I looked at the bedside table. There was something there. A letter, in my father's handwriting. What was written on it? I cannot say. But when I read it, I knew. I knew that my life would never be the same. Now, the question is, would you dare to call the dead? The following days were a blur of fear and confusion. I could no longer distinguish where reality ended and where my nightmares began. What happened that night, in that dark hallway, seemed to have broken something inside me. My mind was torn apart, and the weight of those hissing words still echoed in my ears, haunting me every moment I closed my eyes. I tried to ignore the letter. I was unable to get rid of it. The letter in my father's handwriting. No matter how hard I tried to avoid looking at it, his name seemed etched in my mind, as if being pulled by an irresistible force. And then, one night, something happened. I was home alone, in the dark, as usual. The letter was on the bedside table. I could no longer ignore it. Unable to control myself, I approached the table and picked it up, feeling that something terrible was about to happen. As I opened the letter, the first thing I saw was a sentence. It wasn't a sentence my father would have written. It was a cold and threatening phrase, but I knew that the handwriting was his. Death is not the end. It is only the beginning of what truly awaits us. I never left. And you called me. Chills ran through my body with the intensity of an electric shock. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. The room seemed to be shrinking, as if the walls were closing in on me. The silence, that heavy silence that always haunted me, became even denser. That's when the light flickered. First faint, then an explosion of brightness. And suddenly, everything went completely dark. I was blinded, not just in the literal sense, but as if my mind had been stolen. And then I heard. It was a low, dragging whisper coming from inside my head, as if several voices were trying to speak at once. But one stood out, a deep and familiar voice. It was my father. "You knew, didn't you?" you knew the price. Now we are together forever. The feeling of suffocation was instant. The air vanished from my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs were paralyzed. His presence was in every corner of the house, spreading like an immense shadow that consumed everything around. I could no longer see. I could only feel that crushing pressure, the weight of something about to completely devour me. The letter was now burned, turned to ashes, but the words were still there, etched in my mind. The walls, the furniture, everything seemed to disintegrate into a dark haze, until nothing was left. And then he appeared. I felt, before seeing him, the warmth of his presence. It was the familiar scent of a father, but distorted. The smell of decomposing flesh, of absolute emptiness. When I finally saw him, he was there, standing before me, but he was no longer himself. My father's figure was now like a corpse, his bones visible through pale, decaying skin, his eyes sunken and empty. You called me. Now I am part of you, he whispered, as his mouth stretched in an unnatural way. I screamed, but there was no sound. The air was thick, as if my body was being drained of any possibility of salvation. He moved closer, and I could no longer move. I was completely paralyzed, in a state between absolute fear and acceptance, as if I knew there was no escape. And then, the last thing I heard was a crack. Something breaking inside me. What happened next, I don't know. What remained of me? I am no longer me. The house was found empty days later. The police searched for weeks, but nothing of me was found. Neither my body nor any trace of something indicating that I had truly existed. Just the smell of death and something much older lingered in the air, like a presence that refused to leave. And now, you who are listening, let me ask you, would you dare to seek answers from beyond? If you were to hear me, to ask me now, I would say there is a price to pay, and that price, my friend, is more expensive than you can imagine. You may even think you're playing with the unknown, but remember, when you invoke what lies beyond death, there's no turning back. Because what you call might very well come to stay. The first message appeared on my phone 2 days after the funeral. I was at home, trying to sort through the mess of papers, flowers, and belongings my mother had left behind. It had been a long, exhausting day, and I felt drained, both physically and emotionally. She had left suddenly, and the pain still felt like an unbearable weight on my chest. It was hard to believe she wouldn't be there anymore. Her voice, her smile, everything I had always known as part of my life, had faded away in a sigh. But that day, amidst the emptiness of her home, something happened. Something I couldn't understand. The message appeared on my phone screen, the alert sound cutting through the silence of the empty house. The number was unknown, but the profile picture was of my mother, a photo I knew by heart, taken on her birthday last year. I love you, my daughter. I will always protect you. What was that? I froze in place for a moment, staring at the words that appeared on the screen, slowly absorbing the meaning. The number wasn't from any of my family members, not even close friends. A chill ran down my spine, but the pain of loss made me ignore any strange feelings. I took a deep breath and then typed a response, not thinking much. Mom, are you okay? How is this possible? It took a few minutes, but then the reply came. The discomfort grew with each word that appeared on the screen. I am here, always near. I see everything you do. Don't be afraid. I stood still, looking at my phone, a knot forming in my throat. I knew my mother would never say something like that. She wasn't one for mysterious messages or words that could be interpreted ambiguously. She had always been clear, straightforward, full of life. So why were these words coming from her now? I looked around the house. The atmosphere felt darker than ever. The sound of the wind hitting the windows seemed more intense. The silence became heavy, oppressive. But I couldn't shake the need to continue. I took a deep breath and replied, Where are you? What's happening? The response came quickly, as if something had been waiting for my question. It didn't sound like my mother. The message lacked the gentle touch, the tenderness she always conveyed. The words were dry, empty. I am home. Close to you. Don't stray from me. Something was wrong. The tone of the words wasn't what I expected from my mother. Those messages didn't seem to be from her. The sentences were disconnected, lacking the emotion that always accompanied her. It was as if I were speaking to a cold, distant voice that had no life at all. The response sent chills down my spine. I had heard stories about paranormal phenomena, about spirits trying to communicate, but I never imagined something like this would happen to me. I didn't believe in ghosts or the afterlife, but at that moment, with my phone in hand, a strange sensation began to grow inside me. And then, the last message appeared. You can't get rid of me. I'm here. And I'm staying. Fear took hold of me, like a cold draft seeping into every inch of my skin. My heart raced. I raised my eyes, trying to calm my breathing, but the silence around me seemed to become more oppressive with each passing second. That message, it couldn't be real. I knew that. But what if it was? Minutes passed slowly as I stood there, frozen, staring at the phone with a fear I had never felt before. The house felt quieter than usual, but suddenly, the sound of something being dragged came from upstairs. A faint but distinct sound, like someone was dragging themselves down the hallway. Panic set in. I got up from the couch and, with the phone still in hand, walked toward the stairs. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, and I sensed that something was wrong. I climbed the steps, the feeling of being watched intensifying. I reached the door to my room, and a strange pressure began to fill my chest. But before I could open the door, I heard it. Something whispering my name, low and guttural. Lucia. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know where it was coming from. But fear paralyzed me for a moment. Then, with an irrational impulse, I opened the door and quickly stepped inside. The room was empty, but the air was thick, as if something had just left. I searched the entire house but found nothing. I found no one. However, when I returned to the couch and looked at my phone again, a new message had appeared. They are waiting for you. That was the last message before I began to hear the whispers again, this time closer, more real. As if someone were behind me, waiting to tell me a secret. I knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. I had made a decision I couldn't undo. Something was communicating with me, and I was in danger. The question was, who or what was behind all of this? And why was I starting to hear her voice again? The night that followed that first message was torment. I couldn't sleep for a second. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt something dragging inside the house. With every shadow, a low sigh. The wind passing through the cracks in the windows seemed to whisper my name. But it wasn't the wind. I knew that. Throughout the night, I kept my eyes glued to the phone, hoping that something, anything, would help me understand what was happening. The messages didn't stop. With each passing hour, new words appeared on the screen, as if someone were feeding off my anguish. As if that being, speaking through my phone, knew exactly how to drive me to despair. Those words, they were far from comforting. They were threatening. Weak yet threatening. Emptiness and coldness filled every message. One of them said, "You will understand when it's too late." But when I looked around, everything seemed normal. It was as if an invisible presence was in my house, watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I walked through the house and felt the cold air, colder than usual, as if someone had opened a door to the beyond. And then, I started to hear the sounds. At first, they were just soft whispers, almost inaudible. I believed it was my mind, weary from pain, trying to create something that explained what was happening. But then the sounds became clearer, closer. I heard footsteps in the kitchen. Heavy, slow steps, as if something, or someone, was crawling on the floor. The light in the house was dim, barely illuminating, but the footsteps continued. I stopped in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do. Fear paralyzed me, but curiosity pulled me toward the kitchen. I entered, the lights flickering with each step. Then I saw it. The refrigerator was open, but what made me break into a cold sweat wasn't what was inside. What made me freeze was the reflection. In the refrigerator door, I saw the reflection of something behind me. Something that was moving slowly. When I turned quickly, there was no one there. But I knew what I had seen. Something was there. Something was watching me. I ran to my room and locked the door. The phone was still in my hand, but my mind was completely consumed by terror. The messages wouldn't stop. They came in faster and faster, as if the creature, whatever it was becoming more desperate, more anxious. The last message said, "Don't turn around, Lucia. They're right behind you." I instantly turned my head, and the air that had been missing from my lungs flooded my entire body. Nothing was there. But the heat that invaded my body felt abnormal. It was as if I was being watched from all sides. I tried to look for something, anything that could explain, that could bring some sense to that madness. But then I heard a voice, so clear and distinct, that it seemed to come from within my very brain. "I am inside you." I almost fell back. Panic overtook me with an intensity one never imagined I could feel. I knew I was no longer alone. Something was inside me. Something was watching me. Not just physically observing me, but something touched me subtly, corroding me from the inside, stripping away my sanity. And then, the phone vibrating in my hand. A new message. "Look at the photo. You will find me." I opened the message quickly, my heart racing, my hands sweaty. The photo was there. It was a picture of my mother, yes, but something was different. I saw a detail I had never noticed before. The photo had been taken many years earlier, during the vacation we spent at the beach. I was just a child. But the most disturbing part was in the background. A reflection. The reflection of a woman, dressed in black, with empty, completely white eyes. The worst part is that when I looked at the image, something in the photo started to move. The woman's eyes in the picture began to glow, and she smiled. I couldn't understand how this was possible, but something inside me told me that woman was not my mother. It was something masquerading as her. That's when the whispers returned. But now they were louder, clearer, closer. I was no longer in the house. I was in another place, in another dimension. I felt the air was heavier, dense, filled with something Latin. I couldn't see clearly, but I knew something surrounded me, something that was everywhere. A suffocating, dark presence, ready to swallow me whole. And suddenly, the air closed in, as if someone had put me inside a bag. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. That's when I heard the last voice. The voice that made my stomach churn, that sent chills down my spine with terror. My mother's voice, but a distorted version. "You can't escape from me, Lucia. I am your mother now." And I knew, at that exact moment, that I was not alone. Not in my mind anymore. Not in the world anymore. Something had crossed to my side. Something much older than me. Something that had been waiting for the right moment to take what was its. The photo. The messages. The strange feeling. It was not just a coincidence. I was dealing with something that should not exist. Something that had already settled into my life. Something that was no longer my mother. I don't know what happened to her. I don't know what she became. But with each passing day, more and more, I feel her weight in my home, in my body. And the last message, which still appears on my phone, every day, every minute, makes me question, who is controlling home? I am you now, Lucia. The next time you look at a photo of a loved one, think before you get too close. The reflection may be more deadly than you imagine. That night was just the beginning, and I knew it. Something was taking over me, infiltrating through my defenses, like an invisible but lethal disease. I woke up that morning with the feeling that there was no safety anywhere. The air was dense, and everything I saw seemed obscured, as if a shadow was cast over every corner of my home. I tried to move on, believing that it was all just a delusion. A nightmare mixed with grief, my mind trying to cope with the loss. But the more I tried to distance myself, the more I felt that the weight of it all was consuming me. The messages didn't stop. On the contrary, they became more detailed, more cruel, more personal. With each new message, something else was revealed. What seemed like a simple attempt at communication was turning into something macabre. The phone itself became a gateway to the unknown. The place where my mother still watched me, but with different eyes. The next morning, a Sunday, I received a new message. The vibration was dry, like a direct blow to my stomach. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, trying to keep myself busy. But upon seeing the screen, my body trembled. "You won't get rid of me, daughter. Look around." I froze. I looked sideways, not knowing what to expect. Nothing was out of place, but the silence was suffocating me. A stillness that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets. I knew I was no longer alone in that house. The messages continued. Some seemed to refer to details that only my mother would know. My preferences. Things I had shared with her, deep secrets and intimacies. Yet, at the same time, the words were distorted, as if someone were trying to imitate her voice but couldn't replicate the warmth, the humanity. Only emptiness remained. I decided to respond. Maybe I was desperate. Maybe I wanted to understand what was happening. With each word typed, I felt a growing knot in my throat, as if something were pushing me into a dark place, a place where I had no control. "Mom? Is it you?" The response was almost immediate, as if it had been awaited with anxiety. "You call me, but I am no longer me. I am what's left. What you left behind." The phone vibrated again. Something was wrong. I knew it. Not just the words, but the energy emanating from the screen felt distorted. The screen glowed with an unreal intensity. Numbers and letters moved as if they were alive. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain control, and opened a new message. "Look, I am in you." That's when I realized, in a snap, that the phone was no longer transmitting words. It was displaying images. At first, they were just old photos of my mother, images in which I was present, but then, the screen began to change. It started to distort, and something began to reveal itself. Something that shouldn't be there. Something I had never seen. The image of my mother appeared, but with completely white eyes, and she was lying on a bed. She didn't look like herself. But at the same time, she did. Her hands were stretched out to me, as if she were calling me. An expression of anguish mixed with indescribable fury filled her face. I tried to look at the photo more clearly, but her eyes began to bleed, a thin layer of blood trickling down her closed eyelids. The blood spread, like a stain that was creeping across the screen. I threw the phone away, but the image continued to haunt my mind. That's when something truly terrible happened. That night, while I tried to sleep, I heard a sound coming from upstairs. It was a repetitive, dragging thud, as if something was slowly and heavily dragging across the floor. I knew it wasn't the wind. I knew it was someone, or something, trying to find me. The thud continued, growing closer. I got up, my cold feet touching the floor, and approached the stairs. I looked up at the dark hallway that stretched to the room where my mother used to sleep. But there was something there. Something that shouldn't be. In the midst of the darkness, a silhouette formed. It was large, bigger than an ordinary person. And what made my spine chill was the fact that it didn't seem human. It had no shape, but its presence was oppressive. The air grew heavy, shadows enveloped everything, and I could barely breathe. I knew something was watching, waiting. The sound stopped abruptly. I stood still, as if any movement could be fatal. Suddenly a laugh. Cold, distant but deep. It came from the dark hallway. It wasn't my mother. It was no one I knew. The laughter came from a place much older, much darker. And then, a voice, whispering what I feared most to hear. "You will follow me. Don't try to escape." My mother's room door creaked open. And there, at the end of the hallway, the silhouette was now approaching, its heavy footsteps echoing in my mind. Like a presence that already knew every corner of my home, every part of my soul. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't my mother. Not anymore. Something had taken hold of her. Something that hides behind empty eyes, in the shadows of the beyond. And deep down in my soul, I knew there was no escaping anymore. The weight of the house seemed to intensify with each passing minute. I didn't know what was happening, but something was gliding through the shadows, infiltrating the walls, hiding in the crevices. The silence was more disturbing than any scream. And I, stagnant, powerless to react, knew I was trapped in a reality that no longer made sense. I continued to hear the laughter. It was closer now. I felt the cold air, the putrid odor of something decaying, but nothing prepared me for what happened next. The hallway light flickered, and in the next moment, a figure appeared. It stood in the darkness, motionless, but the contours of its body were sharp and distorted, as if the space around it twisted and bent, afraid to touch it. It was my mother, or what was left of her. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry. My legs trembled, unable to move. She slowly approached, her face already unrecognizable, as if the flesh were melting, dripping to the sides, distorting. Her eyes were white, but not in the empty way they had been before. Now, they were completely blind, a murky mass, as if a fog had filled them. Her mouth opened, and instead of words, what came from her throat was a guttural, ragged sound, as if she were trying to speak through something that was suffocating her. I felt an intense cold, so icy that my hands were starting to tingle, numb. The laughter wouldn't stop. It was not just a human laugh, but something much deeper, coming from a place where souls get lost and dissolve. I slowly recoiled, my heart racing, hands sweating. She stepped forward, and with the movement, the air became thick, heavy, as if it were trying to swallow me. The house's light flickered frantically, now accompanied by the sound of a distant drum. The floor seemed to tremble slightly, as if some invisible force was approaching. Then the voice came again. But it was no longer just my mother's voice. It was a multitude of voices, overlapping, distorted, frantic, as if they were coming from a fissure, from something deep, dark, and unfathomable. You don't understand. I didn't leave. I am still here. I always have been. I felt a chill running down my spine. They were not words. They were presences, memories blending with my perception of reality. It was as if my mother had never really departed, as if she were there, somewhere, waiting to take me away. "This is not what you think," she said. The voice held no humanity anymore, just a coldness that was impossible to ignore. "You will find me, at the bottom of everything." I knew in that moment that something much older and more malevolent had infiltrated my life. Something that disguised itself as my mother's image, a twisted and cruel representation of what was left of her being. But that was not her. Not anymore. I had already been consumed by the lie, by the illusion. I tried to scream, but nothing came out of my mouth. Then, without warning, the whole house seemed to collapse. The walls closed around me, the ceiling caved in, and the floor crumbled beneath my feet, dragging me into a deep abyss. I fell, but there was no bottom. There was nothing. Just an unfathomable darkness, where the weight of my mother's presence crushed me, drew closer, completely engulfing me. When I finally opened my eyes, everything was silent. Absolute darkness enveloped everything. My house, my home, everything had vanished. And the only thing left was the sound of something thumping, slowly. Like a clock, but with a rhythm that did not belong to time. The phone. The phone I had thrown away. It was back in my hand, vibrating frantically. I looked at the screen, my body paralyzed with terror. The message glowed on the screen, cold as a corpse. "You cannot escape. I am what remains of you." And then I saw. It was no longer words. It was an image. The photo I never wanted to see. The photograph of my mother, but it was not her. It was me. The reflection I saw on the screen no longer had form. It was distorted, deformed, with blank eyes and a mouth open in a grotesque smile, like an echo of what it had once been. And then the laughter came again, louder. Now, with an unrecognizable tone, as if everything, including my soul, was being devoured. I could no longer distinguish where my consciousness ended and where the darkness began. The last sound I could hear was the chilling whisper that came from the screen. "You are here, but you are no longer you. You will never leave." And from that moment on, I knew there was no turning back. There was no escape. Because where I was, there was no longer any light. And the worst of all was that, somehow, I knew this would never happen again. I would never leave. The true damnation was knowing that my mother was never gone. She was in me. And now, I am what remains. It was a rainy night, one of those where the sound of water hitting the windows seems to seep into your soul, making everything feel even denser, heavier. I was at home, alone, sitting at the living room table, with the dim light of the lamp flickering and casting grotesque shadows on the walls. There wasn't much to do. The day had been long, tiring, and the sound of the rain left me immersed in a sense of loneliness. I'm not the type to usually answer unknown numbers. It didn't make sense, but that night something felt different. The phone rang. I looked at the screen. The number was unknown, but something compelled me to pick up the device. Something I still can't explain today. An impulse, perhaps. A premonition, as if that moment was significant. Something in my chest tightened. Hello? The voice on the other end was familiar yet strange. I recognized the tone immediately, the way of speaking. It was Lucas, my childhood friend, whom I hadn't spoken to in months. In fact, we hadn't talked since he pulled away, as if something had dragged him into a dark place. But there, in that call, he seemed so normal. Hey man, it's Lucas. Are you okay? His voice had the same vibe as always, soft and welcoming, as if nothing had happened, as if he wasn't someone who had distanced himself from my life, as if nothing wrong had occurred. I didn't know what to think, but something inside me calmed down, as if that familiar sound was a relief. Lucas? Where are you? I wasn't expecting your call. How are you? I tried to start a conversation, but something felt off. His voice was laden with something I couldn't identify, a tone I had never heard before. But deep down, I tried to ignore it. He replied, but now with a different tone. Lower, more drawn out. It was as if he was far away, very far away. I'm here, where I've always been, you know. But you can't see me, no. I can't get out of here. I didn't quite understand. Those words began to make sense, but at the same time, they didn't. Something unsettled me. His voice sounded distant, as if he wasn't speaking directly to me, but from somewhere beyond reach, something dark, a place where light didn't reach. But that was ridiculous, wasn't it? Lucas, what's happening? Are you okay? Where are you? I was starting to feel a chill down my spine. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The rain pounded harder against the windows, as if it were building up, threatening to overflow. And then, his voice, now more distorted, returned. I can't get out, man. I can't. Pause, but can you hear me? I swallowed hard. My body was frozen. That feeling that something was wrong grew within me, a sense of dread I had never felt before. And before I could say anything, his tone changed again. Now it was deeper, almost a whisper. I shouldn't have called. I shouldn't have reached out to you. Pause, but it's too late, it's already done. My breath became heavy. I tried to hang up, but my finger wouldn't move. I couldn't. Something held me there, like a heavy anchor, immobilizing my will to free myself from that call. And the voice grew stranger and stranger, more muffled, as if he was speaking from inside a hole. And then I heard something horrible. You won't be able to let me go, you won't. Pause, I am already here. That's when I heard it. Something behind me. Something I didn't want to hear. A sigh. Low, almost imperceptible, but I heard it. Clearly, as if someone was softly breathing on my neck. Panic overtook me in an instant. I turned abruptly, but there was no one. No one in the room. I was alone. There was nothing there. I looked back at the phone, and Lucas's voice continued, now slower, dragged out. He said one last thing, a phrase that made me understand what I had just heard. I've never been this close to you. I couldn't think anymore. The phone slipped from my hand and fell to the floor, but the voice didn't stop. It continued, even after the device had silenced. And that sigh coming from a place where no light existed anymore, still echoed, still lingered in the back of my mind. Now, every night, when the rain hits the windows, I listen. And I know something is calling me. And no matter how hard I try, I can't escape. That night was just the beginning. But at the time, I didn't yet know the extent of what was about to happen. The next morning, I woke up exhausted, feeling as if I was somehow being watched. as if my eyes were being observed by something no longer in this world. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a manifestation of my subconscious, mixing memories of Lucas with the stress of the previous night. But the shadows on the walls, the marks on my neck, those I didn't remember making, all of it was consuming me in a way I couldn't understand. I tried to stick to my routine, but the phone never left my side. Always close, like a constant reminder, as if it knew I wouldn't have peace until I answered again. The silence, that heady and deafening silence that followed me, was worse than any noise. And deep down, I knew something was waiting for me, something that existed only on the line, where death and life intertwine in a distorted way. I tried to ignore it for days. I tried to escape the idea that the call was real, but fear seeped into my mind like poison, corroding my sanity. It was on a Wednesday, exactly a week later, when I was alone at home, that he called me again. This time, the man was no longer present. The environment was too silent. I was in my room, lying on the bed, trying to relax when my phone vibrated on the nightstand. An unknown number flashed on the screen. My stomach tightened. I hesitated for a long moment, the feeling of despair swallowing me. But then, as if it were a force beyond me, my fingers touched the screen, and I answered. "Hello?" My voice sounded hoarse, shaky. The response didn't come immediately, but the air in the room seemed to change, becoming thicker, as if something were approaching. I felt panic consuming me, a chill running down my spine, when finally the voice on the other end was heard, quieter than last time, almost inaudible. "I'm waiting." "Pause, where are you?" The tone of the voice was grotesquely distorted now. It was as if something was very wrong, something I couldn't identify. But at the same time, it was unmistakably Lucas. His name. I knew it was him. I swallowed hard and tried to react. "Lucas, what's happening? Where are you?" The words came out without thinking, as if they were a reflection of an uncontrollable need to understand what was happening. But deep down, I already knew there was no logical explanation for this. "I'm inside something, inside." A prolonged pause here in the dark. With each word, the sound of the voice seemed to fade even more, as if being swallowed by something very deep. The air in the room felt heavy. My body was tense, paralyzed, and the only sound I could hear was the ragged breathing that I didn't know if it was mine or his. I knew I needed to hang up, but my fingers were too cold to move the phone. Fear prevented me from reacting. Then, the voice transformed, distorting into something more grotesque, more monstrous. "I can't get out, man. I can't get myself out of here. I can't go back. Pause, it's dark, so dark, and I'm underneath, at the bottom of everything." The feeling of claustrophobia intensified with each word, as if the walls of the house were beginning to close in around me. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst came next. I heard a sound. Not Lucas's voice, but something that was there with him. Something that was no longer alive. A breath. Quick, labored, but in many tones, as if there were more than one being breathing at the same time. Something, or someone, breathing with a painful effort, as if it had been taken from a place where there was no more air, and yet, it was there, on the line. Something that shouldn't be alive. And then I heard the worst, the sigh. It was the same sigh, the one I had heard the night before, but now it wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from the line. It was coming from inside the phone. From inside my head. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. The phone fell from my hand. The sound of the breathing intensified with each second, as if it were in every corner of my house. Something was approaching me, moving along the walls. I saw the shadows, distorted, stretching to the limits of reason, becoming misshapen forms, and I felt the presence of something that was there with an insatiable thirst. Something that should never have been awakened. But before I could react, before I could move, a voice whispered, closer now, to my ear, as if it were right there, beside me. Almost as if the presence were on my skin, in my mind. "You can't leave me, not now." My body froze. I no longer knew what was real. The whisper was inside my head. What I heard was no longer coming from the phone. It was with me. I started to scream. Scream to try to rid myself of the feeling, but the voice, That damned voice never stopped. I ran out of the house, but the shadows followed me, and I realized the truth. I would never be free again. I don't know how I managed to get home after that. What happened in the hours that followed, after I had run out desperately, is shrouded in a dark fog, as if my mind had completely distorted. I was in a state of confusion, of absolute panic, as if every step I took was a fatal mistake. I dragged myself through the city aimlessly, like a being on the run, a puppet of fear. When I finally managed to get into a safe place, a cheap hotel on a deserted street, the voices, the shadows, and the whispers didn't leave me in peace. Those voices, that dragged breath, it all followed me. Even in bed, the sounds were so vivid, so real, that I could barely sleep. When I finally fell asleep, the darkness seemed to swallow my senses, and I was back in the nightmare. But what woke me in the middle of the night was not just any nightmare. It was not merely the weight of the night or the stuffy heat of the room. It was a feeling, a touch. A cold, gentle touch, almost imperceptible, on my neck. It was as if something was behind me, there, where I couldn't see. I screamed. I screamed like never before. And in that scream, a figure formed before me. It was not a clear image, but something indistinct, like a shadow cast on a black background, as if it were forming in the darkness. I couldn't distinguish a face, but I could feel the presence of someone, or something, there, before me. The voice. That macabre, distorted voice whispered in my ear. "You can't escape, never again." I didn't know what to do. I was frozen in place, unable to leave. My feet were firmly planted on the ground, and my mind was drowning in that uncontrollable terror. I wanted to scream, to learn, but my body refused to obey. The sight before me was the same as I had seen on the phone line. Shadows, distorted, with grotesque shapes contorting, stretching as if they wanted to break free from their own flesh. I couldn't distinguish where the shadow began and where it ended. It made no sense. It was a being without limits. And then it spoke again, with a clarity that cut through my heart. The voice was no longer just Lucas's, but something much, much older, deeper. Something that had inhabited the depths of the world for far longer than I could imagine. "They will come for me, you will help me return." I started to scream desperately, fighting against the feeling that something was controlling me, something that was dragging me away from reality. But the more I screamed, the more intense the presence became. The shadows around me began to move, crawling along the walls, the ceiling, the floor. My heart was about to explode. I felt something touching me, enveloping me, consuming me. And then, the most macabre thing happened. The shadow, which until that moment seemed like a mere projection, materialized. His form approached me, and I felt its physical presence, a sensation of weight, of something that was about to devour me. I saw death. It had no face, but it was unmistakable. It was an emptiness, a black hole. It was waiting, just waiting for me to finally accept what was about to happen. I saw myself again, looking at my reflection in a mirror. But what I saw was not me. It was Lucas. His face was distorted, as if it had been whipped from the body and put back low. The eyes were glazed, lifeless. The body was pale, as if it was slowly rotting. I wanted to run, but something held me back. Something was anchoring me to the ground. Lucas's voice spoke for the last time. "I am going to the depths, and you will come with me. There is no escape. We are all dead." The sensation of being pulled into the abyss, of being swallowed by something shapeless, was what made me lose consciousness. I don't know how long I spent in that state of macabre ecstasy, but when I woke up, I was back home. Only things were no longer right. I was no longer alone. Every mirror, every reflective surface, now showed a shadow by my side. Even when I closed my eyes, I felt the presence around me. It was no longer a phone. It was no longer a call. It was something that was inside me. Something that fed on my soul. I looked at the phone, my hands trembling, knowing that if I answered, there would be no turning back. But at the same time, I couldn't help it. The fear consumed me, pushing me deeper into that endless darkness. I knew the call would come. And I knew that when it did, it would no longer be Lucas on the line. It would be nothing human. The last time the voice spoke, it was inside my mind, But I knew I was not alone. We are waiting. You will return, no matter what you do. And that's how I realized my fate was already sealed. I was lost. They didn't just want to scare me. They wanted my soul. Now, there is no difference between the living and the dead. I am next. I could no longer deny what was happening. Each night was torment, a cycle that repeated endlessly. Those voices, those presences. They were with me, inside me, and I could no longer distinguish what was real from what was a nightmare. The sound of the phone, which once terrified me, was now just a dark expectation, like a prelude to something inevitable. I had tried everything. I ran to distant places, sought help from mediums, priests, anything that could free me from that presence. But nothing worked. The faces of Lucas and the others, those who came in my visions, seemed to twist more and more, their mouths contorting into grotesque expressions, as if they wanted to call me back to the abyss from which they should never have emerged. And then, one night, that rainy night, when I finally fell into a deep sleep, what happened was beyond anything I could imagine. I woke up in the middle of the night, but I was no longer alone. Not just because of the presence of shadows, but because something much more terrifying had happened. Something I should have expected, but that caught me by surprise. The moonlight illuminated fractions of my room, and when I looked at the mirror in front of my bed, I saw the reflection. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Lucas, nor any other familiar face. It was the reflection of something older, more distorted. The image of something that had inhabited the place since before I was born. Its eyes were empty, and the smile that appeared on its lips was more a stretching of flesh than an expression. Then came the voice, the one I had feared all along. It was no longer on the phone line, no longer just in the shadows. It was now physical. It was real, and it was before me, whispering in my ear as if it were forcefully kissing me. You are mine now. I tried to scream, but my voice failed. My throat, tight and dry, couldn't make a sound. It made me understand that I was no longer there. It was no longer my mind, my soul. What was left of me was being devoured slowly, by the same beings that had called for Lucas, by those who had crawled into my life as if it were inevitable. That's when I realized the horrible truth. The call was not just coming from the phone. Death was not trying to scare me. There was no more life or death. They were consuming me, turning me into something worse than dead. I was not being haunted by a mere presence. I was the prey. The prisoner of an endless cycle, a soul condemned to be taken, to be torn apart from within. And then, the mirror began to distort, as if it were a broken window. Something was coming from within it. What I saw, what emerged from its surface, was the image of Lucas, but not as I knew him. Not as he was in life. He was deformed, torn apart, his body almost unrecognizable. And his hands reached out towards me, stretching like tentacles, pulling me into the glass, into the reflection. You will be like us. I fought, I screamed, I clung to what remained of reality. But everything around me was crumbling. The room, the house, the sounds. Everything merged into one, a living darkness that devoured me, pulled me in. The mirror was no longer an object. It was no longer glass. It was a passage. It was the way to the bottom. And there, on the other side, I saw the empty eyes of all those who had vanished, all those who had been dragged away. I saw them, frozen, their skeletal faces, their mouths open in silent screams. Before I could react, before I could do anything, I was pulled. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. Only the void enveloped me, and Lucas's eyes watched me, the same eyes that were now in me. The phone rang one last time. I knew what that meant. I saw my own face reflected in the darkness. Now, it is I who calls. And so, the story ends, but the call will never end. It was a night like any other, or so it seemed. I was still trying to come to terms with the idea of being home alone. The death of my brother, Pedro, had been recent, so recent that I could still smell the funeral, feel the warmth of hands squeezing mine, the weight of unspoken words. He was my brother, my best friend, and now he was gone, swallowed by a car accident. Everything felt like a nightmare, and I didn't know how to wake up from it. I was in the living room, the furniture still disheveled like the last time he was here, before he was taken away. I was absorbed, my eyes fixed on the television screen without really seeing what was happening. The silence of the house was oppressive, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The heat of the night was suffocating, and the light from the lamp on the table felt colder than warm, a reflection of the emptiness that filled the space. That's when I looked at the mirror. It was there, leaning against the wall, reflecting not just the room but my own image. I had always felt uncomfortable with mirrors. I always thought there was something wrong, something distorted about them, but I never paid much attention to it. Until that night. That's when I saw her. The figure behind me. It was Pedro. His face, with that charming smile, the smile that always made me laugh, was behind me, reflected in the mirror. But something was off. Something didn't fit. He wasn't moving, his eyes fixed on me, but his expression was different. It wasn't the usual happiness, the vibe that always accompanied his smile. It was more like an empty expression, as if he knew something I didn't. I turned quickly, trying to confirm if I was seeing things right. But the room was empty. Nothing but the darkness of the night, and the shadows cast by the dim lamp light. When I looked back at the mirror, Pedro was still there, smiling behind me. The smile was broader, more sinister, and his eyes, which had once seemed alive, were now dead, lifeless. And worst of all, I could swear that his reflection moved slightly, just enough to make me sure that what I was seeing wasn't a mere illusion. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the fear that was starting to grow inside me. This can't be real, I thought. It's just my mind playing tricks after the grief. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself of that, something in my chest told me I was wrong. Then, without understanding why, I reached out toward the mirror. My touch was hesitant, as if the mirror were made of broken glass, expecting at any moment to shatter. When my palm touched the cold surface, the shock was immediate. The glass was icy, much colder than any surface should be. But that wasn't what made me pull back. What made me recoil was the touch. It wasn't just a chill, but the sensation of something strange, as if the mirror was more than glass. As if there was something on the other side, something that touched my hand. I pulled my hand away quickly, but before I could completely distance myself, I felt a pressure. A cold pressure, crushing my hand against the glass. As if something was trying to pull it inside. And at that exact moment, Pedro's reflection, which had been still, moved. He began to smile even more, his grin stretching to the point of becoming grotesque, as if his mouth wasn't big enough to contain it. And that's when I heard it. Not a word, but a voice, soft, muffled, coming directly from the mirror. "You're going to stay with me, aren't you?" I trembled, feeling my stomach churn, but I tried to rationalize. It couldn't be real. It was just grief. It was my mind playing tricks on me. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and opened them, hoping everything would be normal. Pedro's reflection was there, standing, expressionless, as before. But it wasn't just that. There was something more, something different, something that made the air feel even thicker and heavier. I turned to leave the room, to take a moment, to seek any kind of normalcy, but before I reached the door, I felt the cold again. I glanced at the mirror and saw a word written in smudged, blurry letters, as if someone had used their own finger to write, "Stay." I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I needed to get out of there. And that's what I did. But as I ran, a feeling of being watched, something that knew I was going to try to escape, overcame me. Something that wasn't just Pedro's reflection. Something deeper. Something that shouldn't be seen. And I knew, at that moment, that no matter how hard I tried to avert my eyes from the mirror, it was still there, waiting. And I also knew that deep down, Pedro was no longer Pedro. I was still standing at the door of the room, my eyes fixed on the hallway entrance, trying to absorb what was happening. The air was thick, heavy, as if something was covering my lungs. The feeling of not being alone, of being watched, was present in every corner of that house. My eyes scanned the room, but there was nothing there except furniture and shadows. The room felt darker, as if the light from the lamp, once warm and inviting, had been swallowed by the darkness. I went to the kitchen, not exactly knowing what to do. My body was on autopilot, moving at the same speed as my heart was racing. But as I passed through the hallway, a sharp chill engulfed the space. Something was wrong. What had once been just an echo of discomfort turned into a palpable presence. I felt the weight. Something was behind me. Something, waiting. No, it can't be real, I thought. I was starting to lose control over what was happening. I tried to rationalize, but my increasingly confused mind was pushing explanations away. And worse, the messages began. It was no longer just that grotesque smile in the mirror. It was no longer just an opaque and sinister presence. Something much more direct was happening. One day, while I was trying to sleep, my phone vibrated. The screen lit up the room, bringing me back to reality. But when I looked at the notification, my body froze. It was a message. Simple. Cold. Will you be with me forever? I didn't recognize the number. There was no name, no indication of who had sent it. But anguish quickly took hold of me. With trembling hands, I touched the screen and opened the conversation. There were no other messages, just that one, a single line. What unsettled me even more was the profile picture of the number. It was a photo of me with Pedro from our childhood. A photo I knew existed only in my personal album. The messages started coming more frequently. At first, it was just once a day. But then, they spread like ink stains. With each new notification, fear consumed me more, as the messages became more aggressive. You can't escape. The mirror is waiting for me. Stay with me. I blocked the number. I changed my phone chip, hid the devices. But the truth was that with each passing day, I felt Pedro's presence more and more, watching me, in every corner of the house. Not just in the mirror. The room became the scariest place. But it wasn't just because of the reflection I saw in it. The feeling that he was there, in the dark, watching me, was almost physical. That night, something different happened. I woke up abruptly, as if someone had shouted my name. My body was cold, and the atmosphere around me felt suffocating, as if the air had become thicker, impossible to breathe. I sat up in bed, trying to gather courage, but I couldn't see anything beyond the darkness enveloping the room. That's when I heard the sound. The faint sound of footsteps, muffled but unmistakable. The footsteps began in the hallway, light, almost as if someone were gliding their feet. With each step, my heart raced faster. I knew no one else was in that house. I knew it was impossible for it to be a thief or an animal. The house was immersed in unbearable silence, except for the footsteps. I got out of bed, my feet cold on the floor. My legs wavered, fear paralyzing me. But something, a need to discover the truth, pushed me toward the hallway. With every step I took, the footsteps in the hallway increased. But in a strange way, they were getting faster, closer, as if they were following me. Closer and closer, until, in an almost involuntary act, I looked at the mirror. And there he was. Pedro. But it wasn't the Pedro I knew. He no longer had that calm smile. His face was twisted, distorted, as if he were trying to escape his own skin. His eyes were deep, black, as if the very holes in his face had swallowed all the light. His mouth was open in a silent expression of suffering, but he was no longer smiling. He was screaming, but could not make a sound. And it was in that moment that I truly felt the presence behind me. A weight on my shoulders, a cold touch, almost as if something invisible was brushing against my skin, forcing me to look at that reflection. A pressure that seemed to pull me into that glass. I wanted to scream, run, escape, but I couldn't. My body was in shock. Then I heard it, directly in my mind, as if it were a voice at the back of my brain. You will stay with me forever. I didn't know what was happening. I could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. And worst of all, the feeling that Pedro was no longer my brother. He was trying to drag me to another place, to that mirror. The sensation that the reflection was becoming more real than I was. I stepped away from the mirror, but it wasn't enough. There was no escape. Every day, the mirror called to me. And Pedro. Pedro was no longer there, as I knew him. He was becoming something different. Something older, more rotten. Something that shouldn't exist in the world of the living. And now, even as I tell you this, I know I am no longer alone. Pedro is here. He is watching me. And he already knows the answer. I know you are probably thinking that all of this is impossible. I thought so too. I thought I was just going crazy, that the messages, the sounds, the visions, were all the work of my mind worn down by loss. But as the days went by, everything intensified. The messages didn't stop. They got worse. They were no longer just cold, threatening words. They began to be instructions. The first time was when my phone buzzed in the middle of the night. I woke up gasping, sweat pouring down my face. It was almost 3 in the morning. I still didn't know what was happening, but the fear was becoming something physical. An overwhelming weight on my chest. I knew he was there somewhere lurking. I looked at my phone, and a message appeared on the screen like a condemnation. Go to the mirror and touch it. I hesitated. My hand trembled, almost as if it had a life of its own. But somehow, I couldn't ignore it. The fear mixed with a feeling of having no other choice, as if an invisible force was guiding me, controlling me. I got up, my cold feet on the wooden floor, which creaked with each step, until I stood before that mirror. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. The mirror seemed larger than before. The dark wooden frame now seemed to swallow the light from the lamp, making everything darker. The reflection I saw was no longer the same as before. It was no longer just my face or my brother smiling. Now, the reflection was mixed, a grotesque distortion, as if the glass was trying to reveal something beyond what it should. There was something otherworldly about it. As if the mirror was a window to a place dark, lifeless. I saw shadows moving within it, as if they were trying to escape the glass, but somehow trapped. I touched, and upon touching the cold surface of the glass, something happened. I didn't know what to expect, but I could never have imagined what really occurred. The glass flexed, as if it were made of flesh. My hand sank into the surface, as if touching something soft, sticky, yet solid at the same time. Panic overtook me. I pulled my hand away quickly, but couldn't. It was as if the mirror had sucked me in, as if it was clutching my skin. That's when I heard the whisper. Pedro's voice. But it wasn't his voice. It wasn't the voice of my brother that I knew. It was a distorted, cavernous voice, as if it came from an endless abyss, from a place where no sound should exist. It said, "You can't escape anymore. You belong to me now." I recoiled, staggering back, trying to understand what had just happened. The mirror stabilized again, but something was different. What had once been just a cold surface now seemed alive. The feeling of being watched intensified. Every time I looked at it, I didn't just see my reflection. I saw shadows, movements, something behind me. I decided I could no longer ignore it. I needed to find out what was happening, even knowing that it meant losing every trace of normalcy I still had. I felt lost, as if the house had become a strange place, as if it were trying to swallow me. But the most terrifying part was what I still didn't know. I was beginning to disappear. In the following days, the whispers began to grow more frequent, clearer. "Stay with me, don't go, there's no escape." I started to feel weaker, as if my own energy was being drained by something I couldn't see, but that was definitely catching me. And I began to realize I was no longer in control of myself. My vision began to fail. I would look at things and they seemed to move, even though I knew they weren't. My own image started to change. The mirror, always the mirror, was the only place where I still felt real. But at the same time, when I looked, I saw Pedro. He was there, waiting for me. He smiled. But the smile was different now. It was as if he knew something I still didn't. One night, one of those nights when you wake up not knowing if you're dreaming or awake, something truly happened. I was in the living room, looking at the mirror, and suddenly, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was no longer reflected. But Pedro was. Only he was there. His image perfect, as if he were watching me from within, but at the same time, with empty eyes, as if I had been swallowed by that glass. I screamed. I screamed louder than I had ever screamed in my life. But no one came. There was no one to hear. Just the shadows. Just the silence. I tried to run, to escape the house. But when I opened the door, all I saw was the mirror. It was there, at the entrance, reflecting the darkness of the street, the emptiness of the night. It was as if I were trapped inside it, with no way out. And that's when I understood. There is no escape. Pedro won't let me get away. He will pull me into the mirror, to that place where nothing else matters, where darkness swallows everything. And I am the next victim. Now, when I look in the mirror, I no longer see myself. I am just a shadow, waiting to be consumed. I know what you're thinking, that this isn't real. That this is just the mind of a madman. But my friend, if you look closely, you will see the shadow. And it will call you, just as it called me. I know you are hesitating now. You're thinking that maybe I have gone mad, that my mind has given in to the weight of grief and fear. But if you still don't believe, just look at the mirror. Look closely. Don't just look at the reflection of your own image, as you normally would. Look with attention. Ask yourself, am I really alone here? The moment I touched that mirror, my world was ripped away from me. I was no longer at home. I was somewhere else. I can't explain what it was, but I can try. It was as if the mirror were a door, but not a common door. It was an entrance to a space where everything was distorted and wrong. As if the reflection had been twisted into something that should not exist, a cold and empty space, filled with breathing shadows. I screamed, desperate, trying to pull away, but I couldn't. The glass seemed to hold me captive. The icy touch I felt on my skin was not from the mirror, but from something behind it, something that was watching me, waiting. Something that had already touched me. Pedro's hand. But it wasn't Pedro anymore. It was something else. That's when I saw what was on the other side of the mirror, what he wanted to show me. The reflection of my brother no longer had that innocent smile. Now, his eyes were dark, lifeless, as if he were lost, as if his soul had already been consumed by the darkness of that place. But worse still, he was calling me, as if inviting me to enter, to cross over and stay with him forever. I tried to pull away, but the shadows began to move. They stretched, twisted, like tentacles seeking to pull me in, to swallow me. I heard the voices from beyond, whispering to me, "You cannot escape, you are already here. You are with him now." It was then that I realized. Pedro was no longer in the mirror. It wasn't just him, but something greater, something that had taken his place. That presence was not trying to invite me. It was trying to bind me, to swallow my soul forever. And the mirror was the key, the link between two worlds, between mine and his. Between the real and what should not be. The door was open. The moment my hand touched that cold glass again, I was sucked inside. Darkness enveloped me, a heavy darkness that made my chest tighten. I could no longer breathe. There was no air. Only pressure, as if something were crushing my bones. I screamed until I had no strength left. And then the voices began to laugh. But it wasn't Pedro laughing. It wasn't him. It was the echo of my own death. When I realized it, I was inside the mirror. There was no more house, no more world. I was in that distorted place, where shadows danced and formless faces watched me, waiting. I could no longer distinguish the line between the real and the unreal. I no longer knew who I was. And then, with a silent scream, I understood. I was no longer alone. I had never been. I am just a shadow now, a presence, lost in this abyss, trapped in the distance between worlds, between what is and what should not exist. And as you, who are now listening to this story, look into the mirror, you begin to realize that something is already watching you. Perhaps you have already seen the reflection move. Perhaps you have heard that whisper, that familiar voice, coming from the other side, asking you to stay. And if you look now, and if the mirror starts to breathe, if it begins to distort before your eyes, don't try to pull away. Because you already know what happens when you do. The mirror already knows who you are. And it will never let you go. Did you enjoy this story? Then don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. You can also send your story to our email in the description, Who knows, your story might appear here? See you next time, if you're still here.